Knock Knock. Back in 2018, Knock Knock by Kaneki Jones emerged as a socially charged horror short that uses the genre to tell a story both terrifying and tragically real. Unlike most supernatural entries on this list, the horror here is rooted in everyday struggles and systematic failures, which makes its ending hit even harder. The story is rooted in everyday struggles and systemic failures, which makes its ending hit even harder. The story centers on Sinia, a single mother trying to hold things together while also being a nurturing figure in her community. We see her braiding children's hair for a little extra income, and even cooking meals for the kids next door, who are clearly neglected by their own guardians. From the beginning, Sinia is established not as a victim, but as someone who quietly shoulders responsibility for those around her. This makes her all the more sympathetic when the horror creeps in. The turning point begins one evening when Sinia hears chaos from the neighbor's home. Raised voices, the sound of struggle. It's the kind of noise most people try to ignore, but Sinia isn't wired that way. She decides to step in, walking into a situation that spirals out of her control. What she finds is far worse than she imagined, a shocking revelation that reframes the entire story and makes clear that the true horror here isn't a ghost or a monster, but the very real dangers that fester behind closed doors in struggling households. Jones handles the reveal with unflinching honesty. The camera doesn't rely on jump scares or supernatural tricks. Instead, it lingers on human pain and vulnerability, reminding viewers that the most devastating terrors are often the ones rooted in poverty, abuse, and neglect. The realism of the acting only deepens the impact, with performances that feel lived in and painfully convincing. What makes scary is that it weaponizes empathy. The horror lands not because of what we don't understand, but because of what we do. The raw recognition of problems we see too often in real life, wrapped in the familiar language of horror storytelling. By the time the short ends, the viewer is left with a sobering sense of injustice that lingers far beyond the credits. This is why Knock Knock stands tall among iconic horror shorts. It proves the genre doesn't need the supernatural to unsettle us. Sometimes, the scariest thing of all is how close to home the horror really is. Guest. In 2020, the filmmaker Finn Callan delivered Guest, a psychological horror short that blurs the line between mental illness and the supernatural. It opens with a striking image, a young woman in a hospital bed, her head wrapped in heavy bandages covering both her eyes and ears. The nurses who discovered her describe a bizarre scene. She was found in another woman's bathroom, screaming, unable to explain what had happened. From there, the film takes us back into her memories to reveal how she ended up in such a state. The flashback begins in an almost mundane setting, a quiet suburban street at night. The protagonist, already uneasy, is being followed by something that feels impossible to escape. That something is revealed as a terrifying humanoid figure with pale skin and enormous unblinking eyes, a design that feels grotesque yet strangely pitiful. The creature doesn't lunge or roar. Instead, it lingers just out of reach, moving with an unnatural persistence that makes its presence even more disturbing. The chase builds gradually, with silence doing as much work as sound. Unlike many horror shorts that lean on sharp audio stings or sudden edits, Guest thrives on quiet dread, making each step the protagonist takes feel like a countdown to collapse. Her fear isn't expressed only through her screams, it's in her frantic attempts to hide, in the way she covers her ears, and in her desperate need to shut out a world that has become unbearable. The title itself, Guest, suggests layers of meaning. Is the figure an intruder in her life, something alien that has forced its way in? Or is it a manifestation of her own trauma, an unwanted presence in her mind that she can't silence no matter how far she runs? Callan never gives a concrete answer, leaving the audience to grapple with the ambiguity. That uncertainty is what makes the film linger long after it ends. There's also a darkly ironic edge to the short. The design of the monster adds a strange, unnerving absurdity to the terror. It's not funny in the conventional sense, but its grotesque exaggeration makes the horror feel surreal, as though the protagonist's mind is distorting reality under the weight of her fear. By the end, when the narrative loops back to the hospital bed, the story doesn't feel resolved. Instead, it feels like a cycle, a suggestion that no matter how far she runs, the guest will always return. In that way, the short functions both as a nightmare scenario and as a chilling metaphor for how some internal struggles never leave, no matter how much someone tries to shut them out. Ignore It. Directed by Sam Evanson, Ignore It is a 7-minute short released on October 29, 2021, that uses its brief runtime to deliver an incredibly tense family drama wrapped in supernatural horror. The film opens with a family gathered around the dinner table, but it quickly becomes clear that something else is present in the room, a figure known only as the Woman. The rules for survival are simple but chilling. The family must not acknowledge her. If they pretend she isn't there, she'll eventually leave. This premise, while straightforward, becomes increasingly unbearable to watch as the camera lingers on the entity looming in the background, moving closer and breaking the family's composure with each passing moment. The brilliance of Ignore It lies in how it weaponizes silence and restraint. The entity never lunges or screams, but instead exerts its power by testing the family's willpower. For some, ignoring the presence becomes too much, and that failure carries devastating consequences. The short explores how human instinct clashes with survival logic. The harder you try to suppress fear and curiosity, the more it overwhelms you. The visuals are stark, with dim lighting and a claustrophobic setting that traps both the characters and the audience in the same suffocating space. Combined with naturalistic acting, the dinner table becomes an arena where dread mounts second by second. Viewers are left with the unsettling realization that the horror is not only in the entity itself, but in how fragile human endurance really is. Beyond its immediate tension, Ignore It has been interpreted as a metaphor for trauma, abuse, or unresolved problems that families attempt to bury rather than confront. The lesson it delivers is sharp. Some horrors cannot be solved through confrontation. Survival sometimes means looking away, even when every instinct tells you otherwise. Portrait of God. Released in 2022 and directed by Dylan Clark, Portrait of God is a short that leans heavily into theological horror, combining minimalist visuals with unsettling questions about faith and perception. It runs just 7 minutes, but in that time it builds a mood that lingers long after the final frame. The film opens with a biblical quote from Exodus 33:20, "No man shall see me and live." From there, we follow a character named Mia Riley who is practicing a presentation on a mysterious painting known as the Portrait of God. On the surface, the canvas is nothing more than an expanse of black paint, but certain viewers claim they can see something within it, a gaunt figure with glinting eyes peering back. As Mia studies the painting, her composure begins to crack. The audience never sees a full depiction of the figure, but the suggestion of it is more frightening than a clear reveal. The short relies on dark space and negative imagery, forcing the viewer's imagination to fill in the gaps. Each shot is composed with suffocating stillness, and the absence of sound amplifies the creeping sense of dread. The horror here is twofold. On one hand, it's about the fear of seeing something divine that the human mind is not meant to comprehend, and on the other, it's about the danger of obsession. The painting acts as a trap, pulling Mia in until the boundary between art and reality seems to collapse. Portrait of God has resonated with online audiences not only for its scares, but also for the questions it raises. Was the figure truly divine, or something far darker that cloaked itself in religious imagery? Could it be a commentary on how humans impose meaning onto the unknown? Dylan Clark never provides an answer, leaving the audience with an unsettling ambiguity that mirrors the nature of belief itself. This short has been widely shared on YouTube and horror forums, praised for doing so much with so little. With only a single location, one actor, and a cleverly executed concept, Portrait of God has cemented itself as one of the most thought-provoking modern horror shorts. Laura Hasn't Slept. Released in 2020 and directed by Parker Finn, Laura Hasn't Slept is an 11-minute short that reimagines a common fear, nightmares that cross into reality, and spins it into something deeply unsettling. The short opens in a therapist's office where a young woman named Laura describes her recurring dream. At first, it sounds like a typical anxiety session, but as she goes on, the details become more chilling. Laura explains that in her dream, she's visited by a man with a disturbingly wide grin, a face that never changes no matter how often the dream recurs. Her fear is not simply that the man is stalking her in sleep, it's that one day he will finally cross over and kill her. This setup places both Laura and the audience in a liminal space, unsure whether the threat is psychological or supernatural. The therapist encourages her to unpack the fear, but the tension escalates when reality begins to shift around them. The room flickers, the conversation twists, and the smiling man himself begins to appear. These intrusions fracture the stability of the scene, making it impossible to tell whether Laura is still in the office or trapped in another nightmare. The short thrives on its pacing. Moments of calm are punctuated by sudden distortions, keeping the audience constantly off balance. And when the smiling man finally emerges, his presence is brief but devastating. His design is simple, human enough to be familiar, but distorted enough to feel unnatural. The smile is both mocking and predatory, a visual that burrows into the viewer's memory. Thematically, Laura Hasn't Slept is about the terror of inevitability. Laura's exhaustion, her inability to rest, becomes a metaphor for how some traumas or fears cannot be escaped. Sleep, the one place meant to provide safety, becomes a trap she cannot avoid. The impact of the short was significant. Its success caught the attention of Paramount, who brought Parker Finn on to expand the concept into the feature film Smile 2022. While the feature broadened the lore and introduced new characters, many fans still point to Laura Hasn't Slept as the purer, more focused distillation of the nightmare logic that made the idea so effective in the first place. Today, the short remains a touchstone for how minimal resources can be enough to create a lasting horror experience. Lights Out. Released in 2013 and directed by David F. Sandberg, Lights Out is one of the shortest films on this list at just 3 minutes, but it manages to pack in a story that feels complete and terrifying. It plays on primal fear, the dark, and what might be waiting in it. The story begins in the quiet routine of a woman preparing for bed. She turns off the lights in the hallway, and immediately a dark silhouette is revealed at the far end. Shocked, she quickly flips the switch back on, and the figure vanishes. She tests it again. Off, the figure appears. On, it disappears. Each time she repeats the action, the figure seems a little closer, lingering just long enough to confirm it wasn't a trick of her eyes. This sequence establishes the rules in a way that's simple and terrifying. The creature only exists in the dark. It cannot be seen when the lights are on, but it doesn't go away. It waits, creeping forward with every flicker of darkness. The tension grows as the woman tries to reassure herself, turning the lights on and off while her fear escalates. Eventually, she decides to leave the light on and climb into bed, thinking she's safe. But that's when the short delivers its cruel twist. As she lies down, the lamp flickers and dies. The darkness fills the room, and the figure, now inches from her, lunges. The screen cuts to black. The genius of Lights Out lies in its efficiency. It doesn't waste time explaining who or what the figure is. Instead, it locks the viewer into the same helpless position as the protagonist, knowing the danger but unable to stop the lights from going out. The sound design heightens the fear, with the faint creaks of movement in the dark underscoring the inevitability of the attack. The short was such a viral success online that it caught the attention of Hollywood producers, leading to the feature-length adaptation in 2016. While the movie expanded the lore, introducing a backstory and multiple characters, many horror fans still praise the original short for its purity. It's the raw, stripped-down nightmare version of the concept, a fear distilled into 3 minutes of escalating dread. More than a decade later, Lights Out remains a perfect example of how a horror short doesn't need elaborate effects or exposition to terrify, it just needs to trap the audience in a scenario that feels inescapable. Mama. Released in 2009, Andy Muschietti's short Mama is only 4 minutes long, but it manages to condense a terrifying scenario into something unforgettable. It begins with 2 young sisters startled awake in their home. At first, the situation feels ordinary, children roused in the middle of the night, but their fear makes it clear that something is wrong. They creep through the house with wide, anxious eyes, whispering about Mama having come back. As they move cautiously, the sound design becomes crucial. We hear floorboards groan, a faint growl in the distance, and the girl's hurried footsteps. When Mama finally appears, it's not a warm maternal figure, but a distorted supernatural entity. Her body is twisted, her movements jerky and inhuman, sliding through the house in a way that feels more like a predator than a parent. The sisters scramble toward the door, desperate to get away, but the entity closes in with alarming speed. The entire short is structured like a chase sequence. The camera follows the girls closely, capturing their terror in long, uninterrupted takes that amplify the urgency. Unlike many horror shorts that rely on a jump scare and cutaway, Mama sustains the dread until the final moment when the entity finally catches up. The last image lingers, leaving no question that the children are at the mercy of something truly monstrous. The effectiveness of Mama comes from its simplicity. It doesn't waste time explaining who or what the entity is. It simply forces the audience to experience the girl's fear firsthand. The distorted design of Mama and the unnatural way she moves sear themselves into memory, proving that strong visuals and raw atmosphere can be more powerful than elaborate exposition. The short was such a success that it caught the attention of Guillermo del Toro, who championed Muschietti to expand it into a feature-length film in 2013. While the movie fleshes out the lore by adding backstory about a ghostly mother figure bound to the children, the short remains a pure nightmare distilled to its essence. It's a sprint through terror, one that demonstrates just how much horror can be squeezed into only a few minutes when executed with vision and precision. Curve. Released in 2016, Tim Egan's short Curve is one of the most nerve-wracking survival scenarios ever put to film, despite having almost no dialogue or backstory. The short opens abruptly. A young woman regains consciousness lying on a strange sloped concrete surface. At first, it's disorienting. She doesn't know where she is or how she got there, but as she shifts even slightly, the horrifying truth sets in. The surface she's on isn't flat, it's curved downward into a black abyss. If she slips, she'll fall, and the drop looks endless. Her shoes have no grip, and her palms are already slick with blood from trying to steady herself. Every attempt to move causes her to slide a little further toward the void. The camera lingers on the details, the smears of blood on the stone, the tremble in her hands, the helpless look in her eyes, making the audience feel every second of her panic. There are no monsters, no jump scares, just the crushing terror of gravity and the certainty that one wrong movement means death. As the minutes drag on, she claws at the surface, desperately searching for friction. Her breathing grows ragged, her muscles start to give out, and she realizes she can't hold on forever. The sound design is minimal, but devastatingly effective. The scrape of skin against stone, the echo of her shoes slipping, the hollow roar of the abyss below. At one point, she tries to push upward, but her strength fails and she slides dangerously close to the edge. Each near slip feels like the end. The brilliance of Curve lies in its simplicity. It takes a single universal fear and stretches it out over 10 agonizing minutes. There's no explanation for where she is or why she's there, and none is needed. The short works as a pure nightmare distilled in its raw form. You're not just watching her fight to survive, you're experiencing the panic alongside her. By the time the screen cuts to black, there's no release, no relief, no resolution. Whether she survives or not is left unanswered, forcing the audience to carry the dread long after the short ends. Curve proves that horror doesn't always need elaborate mythology or supernatural creatures. Sometimes it's enough to trap someone in an impossible situation and let the human instinct for survival and fear of failure do the rest. Other Side of the Box. Released in 2018 and directed by Caleb J. Phillips, Other Side of the Box is one of those rare short films that starts innocently enough but escalates into nightmare fuel almost immediately. It opens with a couple, Ben and Rachel, enjoying a quiet night together when Ben's old friend, Sean, unexpectedly shows up at their doorstep. He's disheveled, anxious, and carrying a wrapped Christmas present. His excuse for visiting is vague, his behavior unsettled, and before leaving, he insists that they open the gift immediately. Inside the festive wrapping is a simple plain wooden box. At first glance, it seems empty, but the longer the couple stares into it, the more wrong it feels. Then comes the note. Whatever they do, they must not look away. As long as someone's eyes remain fixed on the box, the thing inside, or perhaps behind, cannot move. If they blink, turn away, or leave it unattended, the consequences will be fatal. From this point forward, the film traps both its characters and its audience in a game of unbearable tension. Rachel and Ben take turns watching the box, trying to make sense of Sean's bizarre warning. When Rachel looks away for just a moment, the contents shift. Something inside has moved. Soon after, she peers closer and is met with the haunting sight of a pale humanoid figure with lifeless eyes peering back at her. The box has become a prison for something that's alive, aware, and hungry for freedom. The short masterfully stretches its runtime with the smallest details, the sound of breathing, the weight of silence, the characters' growing dread as their sanity begins to crumble. Who is this figure in the box? How long can they possibly keep watch? What happens if they fall asleep, or if they simply can't look any longer? The film never fully answers these questions, which only amplifies the unease. Unlike many horror shorts that rely on jump scares, Other Side of the Box builds its horror on inevitability. The rules are clear, but impossible to sustain. Everyone blinks, everyone looks away eventually. The box doesn't just contain a monster, it contains the certainty of doom. By the end, the couple's cozy evening has been shattered beyond repair, and viewers are left with an inescapable thought. If the box ended up in your living room, how long could you really last? Behind Closed Doors. Jonathan Button's Behind Closed Doors from 2009 is one of those short films that manages to unsettle its audience with very little time to work with. At its core, it's about childhood fear, the monsters we think live in our bedrooms, and the darker truth that sometimes the real monsters live within the family home. The short begins with a young boy who insists that something sinister is hiding in his room. His pleas for help fall on deaf ears, as his father dismisses his fears with anger and frustration rather than comfort. This setup immediately establishes a sense of vulnerability. The child's innocence pitted against an unseen terror, while the very person meant to protect him becomes a source of hostility. As the night unfolds, the atmosphere thickens. The boy hides under the covers, the camera lingering on shadows and the creaks of the house, building dread out of the ordinary. Viewers are drawn into the boy's perspective, unsure if the danger is supernatural or if the father himself is the real threat. Every sound, every dark corner feels alive with possibility. The tension escalates when the father grows increasingly aggressive, amplifying the unease. Just when it seems the story is heading in one direction, Behind Closed Doors delivers its twist. The boy's fears weren't unfounded, but the true revelation is much more disturbing than a simple monster in the closet trope. The film cleverly blurs the lines between domestic abuse, childhood trauma, and supernatural horror, leaving viewers questioning who, or what, the real monster was all along. What makes Behind Closed Doors especially memorable is its ability to unsettle without showing much at all. The terror thrives on suggestion, forcing viewers to imagine the worst rather than spelling it out. This impact was strong enough to inspire a full remake, where Button expanded and revamped the visuals, deepening the creep factor while preserving the original's core message. Sometimes the scariest things we face aren't creatures in the dark, but the people we trust most. Suck-a-Blood. In 2012, Jake Cudahy and Ben Tillett gave us Suck-a-Blood, a gothic fairy tale horror short that feels like it could have been ripped straight out of the Brothers Grimm archives. This is a story about curses, consequences, and the terrifying way morality tales used to be told before they were softened for modern children. The story opens with a chilling, rhyming narrator who leads us into a dark bedtime story. A young girl is scolded for her habit of sucking her thumb, an act her cruel stepmother deems disgusting and shameful. To punish her, the woman tells the girl that if she ever does it again, a monstrous figure called Suck-a-Blood will come for her in the night. The warning is meant as discipline, but in true folklore fashion, it becomes prophecy. The film unfolds like a living nightmare, with striking visuals drenched in gothic style, jagged silhouettes, candlelit shadows, and a color palette that feels like ink dripping off the page. As the girl struggles with her fear and compulsion, the story builds toward its grim turning point. Alone in her bed, she gives in to her habit once more, and as promised, Suck-a-Blood appears, a tall, nightmarish creature with claws and fangs, creeping into the room to make good on the curse. The moment of confrontation is swift but devastating. The monster does not hesitate, dragging the girl into a fate that seals the tale with brutal finality. Like many old cautionary fables, the punishment far outweighs the crime, hammering home the cruelty of both the stepmother's warning and the universe of the story itself. Suck-a-Blood works not only because of its design and atmosphere, but also because it revives the unsettling spirit of classic fairy tales, stories not told to comfort children, but to scare them into obedience. Its 7-minute runtime feels timeless, as though this is a story whispered around fires centuries ago, now brought to life with modern cinematic artistry. And that wraps up every iconic horror short explained. What's striking about this lineup is how each film proves you don't need a massive budget or a feature-length runtime to deliver a chilling experience. If you're looking for a starting point, Lights Out is the perfect entry. 3 minutes of pure distilled fear that taps into a universal childhood terror. But if you want something layered and thought-provoking, Guest and Ignore It dive into psychological and metaphorical horror that lingers long after the movie ends. Well, if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like the video, share your favorite horror short in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll be covering even more hidden gems and cult classics that continue to shape the horror landscape.